Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. I've been going over a series of how-to videos for elk hunting in the West. It's going to apply to mule deer, any other creatures that you get the chance to hunt out in the Rocky Mountains. I talked about trajectory, how you can run that out on a computer, predict it pretty accurately, and then make changes for it, either by a holdover reticle or a ballistic dial compensator scope, where you can actually dial in the range. Or, if you don't have this kind of equipment, how to determine your maximum point-blank range so that you can shoot from, say, a 30-06, perhaps 0 to 300 yards with no changes in elevation at all. Then if you have a duplex reticle, which has kind of a secondary aiming point below the crosshairs intersection, you can figure out what that's going to be. And for the 30-06, we can shoot out to, I think it's 313 yards, no elevation change at all. And that tip of the post where the duplex gets thick at the bottom is 360 yards. And that's probably as far as you should be shooting a 30-06, especially on an animal as big as an elk. So covered trajectory. Looked at wind compensation, how to measure the wind, how to predict the wind, a formula you can work in your head, and how to allow for that. And the wind can definitely be a factor out in the mountains. The last technical aspect I want to talk about is angle shooting. Whenever you shoot steep uphill or steep downhill, the bullet flies essentially less distance than what the laser says. If I laser, and I'm going to tell you a story about an elk hunt in Wyoming, where we encountered some cow elk on a late license, 585 yards away. They were very high on a ridge, and I knew that the bullet was going to hit lower than anticipated because that's the way it works. If I measure 585 yards along this angle, if I went from 0 to here, make a right triangle out of that, this leg is going to be shorter, and that's how gravity affects your bullet. So gravity is not pulling it for that full 585 yards, it's pulling for this lesser flat range. In the shooter app that I use on my phone, he calls it a look angle. And the app is going to calculate different values of compensation depending on that angle. The point is, steep up or steep down, you need to hold lower because the bullet is not going to drop as much as it would on a flat 585 yard shot. So how do we calculate that? There's a couple ways. And I'll tell you this 585 yard story. This is what got me into the process of learning about shooting angles. This was the last day of a late cow tag. It was like 10 minutes of shooting light left. And I spotted some cows at the top of a ridge. We were driving down a road. And I said, hey, there's 5 cows up there. We bailed out. Laser rangefinder said 585 yards. Now, my scope at the time was a Leupold Boone and Crockett. I had aiming points to 500 yards. I knew I was going to need to hold for less than 585 because of the difference in angle, but I didn't know how much. And the app didn't really have a way for me to calculate that. My laser rangefinder at the time did not calculate angles and did not factor that into the distance. Now they do. Along the way, I choked up a bit of money and I bought a Leica Geovid laser rangefinder binoculars. I think Leica was the first to ever make laser rangefinder binoculars, the first ones I ever saw. They were much larger, they were outrageously expensive, over $4,000 when they first came out. They gradually made them smaller and smaller. They're about the same size as standard 10x42 binoculars now. They're a little bit heavier, but they were still around $3,500. Well, then Leica brought out kind of a bargain basement pair. The $3,500 are built on their ultravid glass, which is just phenomenal. I mean, when you look through this, it just sparkles. And I think they're as good as Swarovski or anybody else out there. Then they brought out, that was about $3,500. Then they brought out this $1,800 street price pair on their Trinavid glass, which is still outstanding optical quality, just not that gilt edge stuff of the ultravids. These will take that angle into effect. They have an inclinometer in them, and most of the handhelds you buy now, not just Leica, but even Bushnell or Leupold or anybody, I think will factor that angle. And with these, they limit to 600 yards. They're only going to do the angle correction for 600 yards, which for me is plenty far enough. I don't think you should be shooting farther than that at game. So if I were recreating that elk incident now, if I stepped out of that truck at those 5 cows and I said 585, That's the actual distance the laser reads. But then below that, it's going to flash another number, and that's the hold for distance. Now, I happen to have been back to Wyoming with these binoculars, stood in the exact same spot where I might have taken that shot that day. I didn't, because it was just too long a shot for me. A couple of the guys that were with me, they opened up and they did manage to get one cow killed. But there were a lot of rounds fired. How many other elk were hit? Who knows? And it's very possible that others might have been hit. But now, this would read 585 and then flash another number below that. I calculated that at one point as hold for 510. This says hold for 515. That's close enough. I might have been 1 or 2 degrees off in my hold of these lasers, and that would make up for that difference. But here's how I calculated out that 585 yard shot. I went on OnX. It's another app for your phone for hunting. It gives you topographical maps and things like that. I knew exactly where I shot from because there was a big rock alongside the highway near the creek. And I went onto that with a bipod pretty steady on those elk, and I thought, I just don't know where to hold, how much low to hold. I'm not going to risk a shot at that. So I chose not to shoot. So I knew that exact location. I drew a 585 yard line and swung it around to about the right angle to where those elk had been. Topography part of the map, I then calculated it was an elevation increase of over 900 feet, so almost 1,000 feet of vertical rise to make that shot. A minute of angle is 1.047 inches at 100 yards. 60 times a minute of angle is a degree of angle. So I took my height elevation, my 900 and some feet, and we'll show it to you on the computer. So I get the calculator out and I say, okay, your 900 and odd feet elevation rise, divide that by 5.25 feet per angle, and that gives me an uphill angle of about 32 degrees. And then I figured out how to go into this app and correct that to tell me how far to hold. I talked to the guy who wrote the app, and the people that write these things are geniuses compared to me. They're also active, competitive, long-range shooters. And so their mindset is to work in mil radians generally. A few of them still use MOAs. But their range table is built in mils, so they know how many mils to come up for a given distance. And most of their shooting is fairly flat, very little major uphill or downhill shooting. So I don't think they worry about the angles that much. They can run the angle out on their app, so they just dial that different amount of mils and they're going to get their hit. But I talked to him about, I said, well, how about building in a feature to tell me the hold for distance? Because that's how hunters do it. We're doing it with hold over reticles, or we're doing it with bullet compensation dials that we dial in a distance. And I mean, he wasn't rude. He was very nice on the phone, but it just didn't seem to register with him that I was trying to make it simple, and those kind of guys like it complicated. But I figured out how to use that app on fairly short terms and get the hold for distance for that. And I will show you that on the computer back in my office. I'll tell you one little anecdote. On that elk hunt, as I said, I chose not to shoot. There were 5 cows, 4 ran over the ridge out of sight. Another kind of circled back, ran about 100 yards into a small patch of timber up there. My buddy Mark, I said, hey Mark, I think you must have hit the one cow because it doubled back and it didn't go over the hill with the rest of them. That indicates to me that it's probably wounded. And it showed absolutely no indication that it was hit. I mean, he was running perfectly strong. By now, light's gone. So he takes off up the mountain. He gets up there over 500 yards is where the cow ended up. Very steep climb, close to 1,000 feet of vertical rise, and he's in knee-deep to deeper snow. And lo and behold, that cow had got into that timber and died. He got it gutted out. He came down off the mountain, and he carries with him, when he does not have horses to pack out meat, he carries 2 500-foot spools of 1/2-inch nylon rope. So we put a stake in his truck bed, we dropped the spool on there, and he took off hiking back up to that dead elk, pulling 500 feet of rope. That wasn't quite enough, so we joined the second one to it, and he probably got to about 750 feet. Finally, he tied that around the elk, and he flashed us with the flashlight, and we had rigged the rope through a snatch block on the trailer and towed it with a truck, and we pulled that elk down off the mountain through snow and through the creek. And it was kind of funny because by the time we got the elk there, loaded up on the trailer, we had 700 and some feet of soaking wet, now frozen, balled up, half-inch nylon rope. And we were just mashing it down to get it in the bed of his truck. He said, I'll take it home, let it thaw out in the garage, and I'll spool it back together. And a logging crew came down the road, and they'd been up there cutting timber for the day. The guy stopped, he rolled his window down, and he looks at this giant pile of frozen rope and a dead cow laying on a trailer, and he goes, what in the world are you guys doing? And my buddy Mark came up with a good one. He goes, we were trolling for elk, and look, we caught one. I thought it was pretty funny. Let's go back to the office, and I'll show you how to do this angled shooting calculation. Okay, before I go over the computer part of it and show you how to get the hold-to distance, there's another way we can calculate angle. I forgot to mention this when I was on the range. This is a device made by Badger Ordnance, available from, I think I stole this picture off of Brownell's. Several places have it. This can be mounted on the side of your rifle. It's a cosine indicator. So what it does, that little red line will rotate up and down according to the angle that you're holding your rifle. And as you can see, it's set on about 99 right now, so that's pretty much flat. It's 0. But as this goes up, when it lines up with these different cosines, that's a divisible number. So in other words, if it lines up with 70, that means I take my measured distance and multiply that times 0.70. I take 70% of the laser measured distance, and that will be my hold-to range. It's a little pricey. I think it's a couple $100 or more to get both the mount and the indicator, get it mounted on your rifle. But if you do a lot of steep uphill, downhill shooting, this is a simple way to calculate that angle. The amount of correction we're going to need to dial in for these steep uphill, downhill shots depends on both the angle, how steep the angle is, and how far the distance is. And in many typical hunting situations, it's really not going to make enough difference to worry about. What I've done here is put a red line on these, and that indicates where the impact is going to deviate more than 2 inches from a flat range measurement. So you can see I've got a chart here. This is my 338 Win Mag. I've got it set for 6,500 feet above sea level. I go down to 600 yards. So here are the, what target shooters are going to call come-ups. Snipers call it. 0 to 200, I need to come up 7.1 inches, or more importantly, 2.3 minutes of angle come up at 300 yards. As much as 10.8 minutes of angle for 600 yards. That's for a flat range. At 15 degrees elevation, it really doesn't make any difference until you get to about 450 yards. Now, I happen to be in the next bigger town from where I live, and I wanted to check out that Leica rangefinder, and at about 450 yards away from a 20-story building, that up angle calculated out to only about 15 degrees. So that's a fairly steep shot, and it made almost no difference at 450 yards. 450 yards is less than 2 inches of variation from the correction I need at the flat range. Only beyond there at 15 yards do I need to factor that in. Okay, and what that means is that equates to a 471 foot increase in elevation. I'm pointing at something 471 feet in the air at 450 yards, and it doesn't really need to be corrected for. So that points out how this is a very steep angle and pretty long range problem that we have to deal with. For 20 degrees, we need to be beyond 350 yards to need to change this. 30 degrees, this is coming close to my 32 degree angle on the 585 yard elk shot. That means we're okay to 250. From 300 yard on, I need to make a correction. 40 degrees, which is incredibly steep, anything beyond 150 yards. But what you're looking at here, if you just look at the bottom there, that means 1,256 feet higher than where I am standing now. It's not straight up. It's not even up to a 45 degree angle yet, but it's very difficult to get that kind of elevation increase in any place where you're going to hunt. It's got to be sheer cliffs up or down. You're going to have to be high. You're going to be at the edge of a cliff, maybe shooting down to the very bottom of a canyon to get those kind of angles. But when you get those kind of angles beyond 20 degrees, beyond 300 yards, we'll say, then we need to factor this stuff in. Okay, this is how I worked out a simple way to get your hold for distance, not the laser angle range, but the hold for distance that you need to put on your bullet drop compensator dial or use in your holdover reticle. I tried shooting this on my phone app and it doesn't show up really well, but this is the same process. And there may be ballistic apps out there that do this for you. By no means do I know all of the apps that are out there. And if someone knows an app that will very quickly and easily calculate the hold for distance on a steep angle, put it in the comments and let me know, because I'd love to get it and have a look at it. But what I do is when you set maximum range, I set the actual range the laser read. So back to my Wyoming trip, the laser said it was 585 yards. I set that in there and I give it the look angle of 32 degrees. I calculated that 32 degree angle on a map sitting in my office. The shooter app that I use has a feature that when you are going to set that look angle, the guy who wrote it, that's his terminology, you can hit a side button and it will tell you the look angle because it uses the instruments in your phone to give that up or down angle. And in fact, what you can do is just lay it on the barrel of your rifle. If you're aiming up towards the general direction of your elk, lay your phone up on your barrel and it's going to tell you that angle. Either hit a button and enter it in, or this one has a kind of a countdown. You put it in countdown mode, you lay it on your barrel, and it goes 3, 2, 1, and then enters that value directly into the app, ready to go. So it told me 32 degrees on my app. When I do the calculation, when I tell it to give me the corrections I need, it says I need 8 minutes of angle correction for a 585 yard shot at a 32 degree angle. That doesn't yet tell me my hold for distance. So now I back out, I keep my distance set at 585 yards, I change the look angle from 32 degrees to 0 degrees. Flat shot. Pop up the solution and then I look for that 8 minute of angle value, or if you're working in mils, whatever it's, if it's 2 mils, whatever it is. Now I look for that 8 here. So what it's telling me is if I were shooting on a flat range, I would need that much correction for 510 yards. 32 degrees, 585, the solution is 8 minutes of angle. Reset it for 0 degrees at 585 yards, and I see that the 8 minutes of angle correction is at 510 yards. You hold for 510. Now with the laser rangefinders that use that built-in inclinometer, that's exactly what they're doing for you. And if you don't have a laser rangefinder that has that angle feature built in, I would suggest an upgrade, because that is by far the easiest and quickest way to determine how to hold. A few months ago in Wyoming, I stood on that same spot and I held that laser rangefinder up to where I recall the elk being. Calculation is for 510. The laser binocular said hold for 515. That is inconsequential. We're only talking just about an inch difference between 510 and 515. So that is definitely going to give me a hit on a deer and especially an elk, which is a much larger target. So the angle is only a problem at beyond about 300 yards and probably beyond 20 degrees. But if you are into those situations and that's the shot you've got on an expensive out-of-state trip, you can be prepared for it by using the right equipment. That angle cosine finder from Badger Ordnance is one way. The laser rangefinders that give you that factor in the up and down angle for you and give you a hold for distance, that's the ticket. That's the way to go. So that's uphill and downhill steep angles shooting, and I think it's just something you need to learn how to calculate. Let that laser do it for you if it can. Get out there and try some of those shots. If you can get out in that steep country, you're out on public land, BLM, National Forest, you can shoot. Certainly not going to shoot where I'm hunting. I'm not going to spook the game, but if I can get out there and try some of these angled shots, and you'll find that it can be very, very accurate prediction of where the bullet needs to compensate it for. So get out there and practice that, and you can handle trajectory. You can modify that trajectory by steep angle when you need to. You can calculate for the wind, and you can be prepared for some distant shots on what might be the trip of your lifetime. And that could be the difference between getting your animal or going home with a tag. And the tags don't taste very good. Trust me on that. So hopefully I've given you some good information. If I have, I'd appreciate a subscription, a thumbs up, and look for my next video. Thank you very much for watching. Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.